Wrestlers often like to present themselves as tough guys, people who don't need help from anyone when it comes to getting the job done. But then, as the Beatles would have told you, it's always easier to get by with a little help from your friends. So, when someone who's stepping into the squared circle needs backup, then one of the easiest ways to do this is by finding a bodyguard. But who are the best bodyguards of all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So, join us as we take a deep dive into Protector's Wrestling's Greatest Bodyguards. Of course, when it comes to those who need protection the most, well, that's often the person on the very top of the card. And this was exactly why, when Shawn Michaels was having a meteoric rise to the world title scene in the mid-90s, he'd enlist his own bodyguard in the form of Diesel. And who was Diesel? Well, that would be Kevin Nash, someone who had first been noticed by the Heartbreak Kid while he was working over in World Championship Wrestling as, amongst other things, the truly terrible character of Oz. Despite this, though, it was clear that there was something in the naturally charismatic giant, and that was why, after convincing Vince McMahon to bring him into WWF in June of 1993, HBK would get a new personal heavy after the boss had rebranded Nash as Diesel. From there, the duo would go on to find a great deal of success together as, with Diesel by his side, HBK would go on to win the Intercontinental title from his ex-partner Marty Jannetty at a live event. And after that, the big man would remain by his client's side as he successfully defended this belt, all while simultaneously, they were also entering the tag team division and winning further gold there. Yes, two dudes with attitude, as they would come to be known, would seemingly be unstoppable by 1994. The only thing that could stop them, in fact, was each other, as it turned out, as after Michaels unintentionally superkicked his partner at that year's Survivor Series, the duo would come to blows. So with both men now at odds and each wanting to be the WWF champion, it became a race to see who would get there first. And while most fans would have pegged HBK as being the clear favorite here, Vince McMahon ultimately saw more dollar signs in Diesel at the time, something which led him to making the decision to put the world title on him at a house show later that month when he pinned Bob Backlund in just 8 seconds. Of course, this understandably left Shawn Michaels feeling slighted, and so, in response to this, he'd go out looking for a new bodyguard at that point, someone to help him reach the same level in the title scene himself, and that was none other than our next subject today, Psycho Sid. Yes, it was in February of 1995 that, after having disappeared from the company for a few years after his loss to Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8, Sid would be brought back into the fold as the new personal backup for the Heartbreak Kid. And this would see him pretty much be slotted right into the role Diesel had portrayed before without much change, with the big man being there to help HBK during the lead-up to his WWF title match against Nash at WrestleMania 11. Unfortunately, though, after unintentionally distracting the referee at one point and costing his client the victory, Sid would find himself in the doghouse the next night on Raw. So, wanting to go on his own for a while then, Michaels would give his bodyguard the night off during his rematch for the title at the following month's In Your House 1. As it happened, however, Sid didn't take too kindly to finding out his services would no longer be required, as being a man who took great pride in his ability to protect others, this was a personal insult to him. And that was what led him to immediately turn on his client then, powerbombing him right in the middle of the ring after that and severing their alliance right there. Of course, this wouldn't mark the end of Sid's run though, as, following this, he'd end up joining the $1 Million Corporation for a while, all before then circling back round to HBK once more when he beat him for the WWF title at the November 17, 1996 Survivor Series. So, it seemed like there was a definite pattern developing in that, if you wanted to win the WWF title at some point, you first had to get a job working for Shawn Michaels. As for one of his closest clique buddies though, he'd take a different route to the top, one that started when he picked up a surprising new bodyguard of his own. Yes, it was in early 1997 that Hunter Hearst Helmsley would first introduce audiences to the ninth wonder of the world, China. Needless to say then, this was entirely new ground for the wrestling industry as, having a woman there to protect a man seemingly went against everything the industry had tried to portray in the decades prior with its tales of tough guy brawlers. Of course, one look at China would have told you that she certainly had what it took to hang with the boys though, something which Helmsley and Shawn Michaels became all too aware of after they spotted her at a gym in 1996. So after convincing Vince McMahon to bring her in then, Triple H would begin using her as a bodyguard throughout 1997, with China here showing no signs of fear when it came to getting in the face of any man who was opposing her client. Often, in fact, she would end up delivering a beatdown to them, something which many of the more old-timers on the roster weren't happy about at first. Those attitudes would be forced to change eventually, however, when after realizing how over the ninth wonder of the world was getting, everyone suddenly wanted to work with her and her client. Yes, whether it be Mick Foley, Rocky Maivia, or Owen Hart, they all wanted a piece of the ninth wonder of the world, and so, in an attempt to get to her, they'd have to go through the game. And this bullseye on their chest would only grow larger when, in the autumn of 1997, the duo would align themselves on screen with Shawn Michaels and Rick Rude as they formed D-Generation X, a group who are still considered to be one of the potential starting points of the Attitude Era. Of course, by this point, Chyna's popularity with fans was growing as she began stepping into the ring more and more, and so that was why, when DX 2.0 formed the night after WrestleMania 14, and she, Triple H, X-Pac, and the New Age Outlaws all turned babyface, people were only too happy to cheer her on. In fact, this would even help propel her towards breaking new ground when she became the first, and to date, only woman to ever win the Intercontinental title later that year. And her journey to the top would only go on to inspire other women to fill similar roles in the future too, something which was the case recently when, over on NXT, Raquel Gonzalez began acting as the bodyguard for Dakota Kai. Now, for some context here, back in February of 2020, Kai had just turned heel on her former tag team partner Tegan Nox, something which led to the two facing off in a street fight at that month's TakeOver Portland. But just when it seemed like the babyface had things won on that night, her opponent revealed her secret weapon when Gonzalez did a run-in and helped her new client to win the match. After that, Kai and Gonzalez would become the scourge of the NXT women's division for the next year, with them drawing many comparisons to Shawn Michaels and Diesel throughout this time. And of course, as the Kevin Nash of the group, it was expected that big things would be in Raquel's future, particularly since Triple H seemed to see a lot of potential in her. So with that in mind then, it felt like only a matter of time until she would branch out on her own. Before she did though, she would stand in Kai's corner throughout a number of matches on NXT television, often helping her to get the win in the process. But while she was doing that, the rookie was also building up a name for herself as a wrestler too, something which was solidified when, at TakeOver War Games in December of that same year, she'd score the winning pinfall over Io Shirai in the titular match. Then, not long after that, her rise would continue when she defeated Rhea Ripley in a last woman standing match at January 6, 2021's New Year's Evil. Still, as far as Dakota Kai was concerned, her backup's allegiances remained with her, and that was why, as the two prepared to take part in the inaugural Women's Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic later that month, she felt confident that they were going to win. And while they would end up winning this one, it wouldn't be long before Kai turned on her friend all over again when, after Gonzalez defeated Io Shirai to win the NXT Women's title at that April's TakeOver Stand and Deliver, the New Zealander would grow jealous and eventually lay her partner out, something which led to a feud developing between the two over the months which followed. Since then, however, both have gone their own separate ways. While Kai is currently part of a stable with Bayley and Io Shirai over on Raw, Gonzalez is working her way up the SmackDown women's division. Way back in the early days of SmackDown, however, it was another woman who was making waves as the newest heavy on the block, because around the time that Chyna was starting to branch off into her own singles career, Nicole Bass would first appear to shake things up. And who was Nicole Bass? Well, she was a bodybuilder who had previously worked in the wrestling industry both in Japan and America, with the latter seeing her be part of the Extreme Championship Wrestling roster for a while. Come March of 1999, however, she'd have made the jump over to WWF where, first acting as the bodyguard for Sable, she'd fill the same role the Ninth Wonder of the World had, though this time in the women's division, at one point helping her client to retain the women's title in a match against Tori at WrestleMania 15. And during this time, perhaps the most notorious thorn in Bass's side would be Deborah McMichael, someone who was then aligned with Jeff Jarrett on screen. Hell, this would even eventually lead to the rookie branching off from Sable altogether at one point after Deborah was able to beat the champion for the title and send her packing from the company altogether in May of that year. Following this then, Bass would begin aligning herself with Val Venus as the two took on Jarrett and Deborah in a series of mixed tag matches, all while they were starting an unlikely romance of their own too. The next bodyguards we're going to look at, Southern Justice, started backing up Jeff Jarrett in mid-1998. as only a few years before this, Mark Canterbury and Dennis Knight had been working for WWF as the Godwins, a pair of pig farmers turned wrestlers who found some degree of success during the New Generation era. Hell, at one point they'd even briefly become the tag team champions after defeating the Smoking Guns, a feat no one could ever take away from them for the rest of their days. What almost was taken away from them at one point, though, was their in-ring careers as, when Canterbury broke his neck after being on the receiving end of a botched Doomsday device during a match with the Legion of Doom, he'd be forced to spend several months on the shelf. And this meant his partner would have no role on the show during this time either, something which must have worried them as, before that, they'd been gaining a lot of momentum. But while they would return eventually, Canterbury's neck injury would leave him a shell of the performer he'd been before. So realizing things needed to be changed up then, Vince McMahon would decide to recast them in 1998 by having them largely move out of in-ring competition and more into a bodyguard role for Jeff Jarrett. Yes, this was the birth of Southern Justice, a duo who, now wearing sharp clothing and sunglasses, couldn't have been any further away from their previous incarnation. And while at least one of them couldn't go in the ring as he once had, it didn't stop them from competing when they needed to, usually in six-man tags with Jarrett, where he and Knight could do the majority of the work. Unfortunately though, while the act did have some potential, it would ultimately prove to be short-lived when, after re-injuring his neck later that year, Mark Canterbury would decide to retire from pro wrestling altogether, leaving Jeff Jarrett to go out on his own and Dennis Knight to rebrand himself as Mideon, acolyte of The Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness. Of course, later he would morph into Naked Mideon too, but that's a story way too weird to get into right now. No, what we'll move on to instead is a duo that also spent a period as underlings of the Dead Man, only for them to then go out on their own and start their very own protection agency. Who was that? Who else but the APA? Yes, the Acolyte Protection Agency, a pairing made up of Bradshaw and Farouk, two tough guys behind the scenes who had started life as the Acolytes in the Ministry of Darkness. Once they moved away from there, though, they'd morph into their more real-life characters of hard-drinking, hard-gambling bar brawlers, with them often being found backstage at this point playing poker and drinking beers. And with them having no allegiances to anyone in particular anymore, it wouldn't take long before other members of the roster started realizing that they may be able to enlist their services as personal backup then, something the APA were only too happy to do as it turned out, as long as the price was right. That's right, no matter who you were, heel or babyface, back in the Attitude Era, if you had the money, you could hire Bradshaw and Farouk to be in your corner for a match and make sure the playing field was evened out. And this was evident in the way they protected the likes of Kai and Tai, Crash Holly, and even the Mean Street Posse at various points over the next couple of years. Of course, what made the whole thing even more entertaining was the fact that their offices, usually situated somewhere in the backstage area, would be nothing more than a freestanding door and a table, with the APA often getting irritated should someone choose to walk around the door to speak to them rather than knock on it. That said, even if they were now ass-kickers for hire, it didn't mean the APA weren't willing to compete for themselves whenever the occasion called for it. And this is what led them to re-entering the tag team title picture in 2001 then, with them briefly capturing the belt when they defeated the Dudley Boys. But even with all this success, the good times would have to come to an end eventually. And for the APA, those good times would at least temporarily end when the two were separated during the first draft in 2002. Not that it would stop them from teaming together forever though, because just a year later, Bradshaw would be moved over to SmackDown where he'd be reunited with his old drinking buddy. And even if this second run was relatively short-lived, with it ending when Bradshaw morphed into JBL in 2004, it gave them the chance to have one more shot at racking up some drinking money by doing what they did best, beating people up. When it comes to another duo of bodyguards, however, beating people up was never really their forte, at least not at this point in their careers as, in the case of J&J Security, things were played far more comedically. Of course, before this, both men involved in the team, Jamie Noble and Joey Mercury, had been accomplished wrestlers in the WWE mid-card, with the former being a cruiserweight champion and the latter being a multiple-time tag team champion alongside John Morrison. By 2014, though, both had settled into retirement, something which had seen them become backstage producers instead of on-screen performers. So it was a nice surprise for them when, after Seth Rollins turned his back on the Shield and joined up with the Authority, he decided he needed some backup so as to help him fend off the threats of babyfaces such as Dean Ambrose and John Cena. And who did he choose for this role? Well, in the spirit of the slimy heel he was, he'd take on Noble and Mercury as his personal security detail, with them acting like budget tough guys from there as they followed him down to the ring in suits and ties, often pretending to speak into an earpiece that wasn't even there. Yes, it was all mostly played for laughs, as by this point in their careers, J&J Security were little match for the babyface roster. So on the occasions they did hit the ring to team with Rollins in multi-man matches against the likes of John Cena, Dolph Ziggler, and Daniel Bryan, then they'd more often than not come out on the losing end. But as it turned out, a loss in the ring would be nothing compared to the destruction that Brock Lesnar rained down upon them not long after this, because while the Beast was feuding with the Architect of the Shield, he'd mow through Noble and Mercury with ease, legitimately injuring the latter and pretty much ending their run right there. That's right, not all bodyguard roles lead to great things for those involved. Of course, this shouldn't suggest that others don't, however, because when it came to someone who Reverend Devon brought in to be his muscle in 2002, Deacon Batista would end up having a very bright future ahead of him. During those early days, though, it would be a case of being thrown into the deep end with a terrible gimmick and getting asked to sink or swim. And what was this gimmick? Well, after Devon Dudley was split from his tag team partner Bubba Ray during the first draft and was forced to go it alone as a solo act over on SmackDown, he'd develop a corrupt preacher-style character, one who briefly served as a spiritual advisor to Vince McMahon. Of course, realizing he'd need protection if he was going to make it on this new roster by himself, he'd enlist a young rookie fresh out of Ohio Valley Wrestling to be his personal deacon and bodyguard. And sure, it may have been an inauspicious way to debut, but Batista would take the gimmick and do what he could with it over the next few months anyway, acting as the silent heavy and allowing fans to get used to his presence while he was doing so. So when the time came for him to reach the next level, then he'd be more than ready, with this opportunity coming after he'd have enough of his boss's corrupt ways, and he turned on him in November of that year. From there, Batista would take part in a brief feud with the Dudley Boy, defeating him with ease here as he then moved straight on to the next phase of his career, a spot in Evolution alongside Triple H, Ric Flair, and Randy Orton. And you all know what happened after that. 4-time World Heavyweight Champion, 2-time WWE Champion, 2-time WrestleMania main eventer, and current Hollywood movie star. Yes, Dave Batista's legacy at this point is secured, so it's strange to look back on the humble beginnings he had. When it comes to our last entry today, however, those beginnings weren't quite as humble because when he was called up to main roster WWE in 2012 as the bodyguard of both Dolph Ziggler and AJ Lee, Big E would get an immediate chance to shine. Of course, at that point, he was still going by the name Big E Langston, and it was during these early days that, using all the strength and size he'd developed as a powerlifter, he was able to be so intimidating that few babyfaces wanted to mess with him, even if they had a beef with Ziggler or Lee. And this would be apparent in his destruction of Daniel Bryan in his first singles match on Raw not long after this, as well as his Best of 5 series with Alberto Del Rio, which followed that, two events which proved he could hold his own in the ring against the best of them. As it happened though, he would end up needing all those skills, because by July of 2013, the trio of heels would have split up when Ziggler dumped AJ, forcing Big E to choose sides as he stood by the Divas champion during the subsequent feud. But even that alliance would fade away too after a while as Langston turned babyface and set his sights on greater things which included him winning the Intercontinental title for the first time in November of that year. After that, it was off to the races as he would follow this up by not only becoming a member of the New Day alongside Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods, but eventually a WWE champion in his own right. Yes, it just goes to show that, no matter where you start, there are no limits on what you can eventually achieve. And if you're already an imposing figure, maybe the best way to get noticed in the first place then is by acting as a bodyguard for someone else. As we've shown today, it's led many people to title success over the years. Just make sure you don't get on the wrong side of Brock Lesnar while you're doing it. Joey Mercury taught us that much at least. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.